Welcome to Across Africa, our weekly look at stories from across the continent. I'm Georgia Calvin-Smith, and this week at a Rotterdam summit, African leaders slammed many of their European counterparts for their no-show for the crucial climate conversations. Africa's racing to adapt to the ravages of climate change, but Senegal's greenlighting of GMO crops has proved controversial. Also, Egypt has a centuries-long tradition of winemaking. Contemporary production is still on a small scale, but wineries are barreling ahead with plans to add polish and popularity to their products. And Cape Town hosted talent from across the continent and names from around the world for Fame Week. A cross-section of African creators from film, television and music got together to make the most of the opportunities in the regional creative economy. But first, African leaders criticised the absence of Western leaders at a key summit in Rotterdam, looking at Africa's funding needs to adapt to climate change caused by CO2 emissions from largely industrialised nations. Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte was the only Western leader who attended in person. The continent emits just 3% of emissions, but is particularly vulnerable to climate change. African agriculture and food security has been greatly undermined by it. One of the adaptation strategies being considered is greater use of genetically modified crops. In June, Senegal controversially authorised the use of GMO seeds for the first time. Our correspondents tell us more.
Aissatou Diouf is a seed specialist at this organic farm outside Dakar.
This is where we stock the seeds from the farm.
She is worried about a new law that authorises the use of GMO crops in Senegal. Genetically modified seeds often turn sterile, meaning farmers have to buy more each harvest. Multinational companies can cash in.
I'm able to produce my own seeds, which remain reproductive over a long time period. These GMO crops could cross-pollinate with my plants, and that will diminish the genetic integrity of my stock. The seeds will mutate and develop other genes.
Rahim Ba set up this farm 5 years ago and teaches students in methods of agroecology.
You need good crop rotation. This allows us to get a good vegetable harvest.
GMO seeds often produce high yields in the short term, but these diminish significantly over time. Rahim believes the new law will have disastrous consequences.
They think that GMO agriculture can feed the world. Maybe at the beginning it can. But in the long term, it's not sustainable. The answer is agroecology, which allows us to be sovereign, autonomous, and have food security.
Senegalese President Macky Sall is convinced that GMO crops will prove a useful tool in adapting to climate change. But despite multiple requests for interviews, none of his government ministers were willing to defend the controversial new law on camera.
Sam Brad piece there for us. Now, most of the people living in Egypt's Jasmine village cultivate the precious flower for use in the creation of delicate perfumes around the world. Around 60% of the world's jasmine production comes from Egypt, but the market is struggling because of climate change and the war in Ukraine. Caroline Lamblay has more.
Most people would recognize its floral scent, but they don't know that much of the world's production comes from here, the village of Shubra in the Nile Delta north of Cairo. Cultivation of this flower is a lifeline for most of the village's roughly 15,000 residents.
Our village is known for growing and collecting jasmine. It's an essential plant for our village.
There's a special way to cultivate jasmine. You can only pick it in the early morning, starting at 1 a.m. But then it starts to get too hot and you can't pick it any longer. It won't be good if you collect it. Early morning is the best time.
The past years have been difficult for these farmers. First, they were hit by the pandemic, and now, Russia's war in Ukraine.
The Russia-Ukraine war has also had an impact because Russia used to import a big part of our production. It's also affected people who are now scared and are not buying what they deem as unnecessary or luxurious goods like perfume.
He says climate change poses another challenge, decreasing production. Still, Egypt is among the world's top producers. It exports a concentrate known as Absolute. It's shipped off to Europe and elsewhere, where most big brand perfumes are then made.
For 100 years, 3 generations of one family in Ghana has painstakingly amassed the world's largest collection of 20th century Ghanaian photographs under one roof. In a studio opened in the capital in 1922, the 50,000 image archive offers a unique glimpse into Accra's transition from a colonial port into a bustling modern metropolis. Take a look.
We have, I'm sure, more than 50,000 pictures. Could even be more. We have a lot of glass plates as well. We have a lot of negatives as well. And honestly, the story they tell is about the history. Those days, the early days from when slaves were taken out. We have the forts. We have pictures of the forts. We have pictures of the politicians. We have pictures of traditions. All of that, really. So there's so much to tell, even the buildings.
If we don't preserve them, it means the nation is going to lose its memory. And our children will come and they will not know anything. They will only be abreast with what is happening around them. But then, we live in the world, a dynamic world, and we must be conversant about the entire history, the entire spectrum of history, what happened in the past. If you know what happened in the past, then you appreciate the present, and then you'll be able to predict the future.
Well, Egypt has a winemaking tradition that dates back to 3,000 years BC. The industry's moved on since the time of the pharaohs, and the country's now one of the foremost wine-growing regions in the Middle East. Local producers are now focusing on improving the quality over the quantity of their output. Our team reports.
It's 10 o'clock in the morning, and labourers are hard at work in this vineyard to the north of Cairo. Here they grow 10 or so different varieties of grape, for the most part those well adapted to the harsh conditions, like the excessive heat, and much more besides. This agricultural engineer has come to inspect this year's crop.
The problems that we find growing grapes in Egypt are the high levels of salt in the earth and in the water. We chose this part of Katatba because the salt levels in the earth aren't very high, and as for the water, it's between 200 and 500 parts per million. It's very well suited to growing grapes.
If the vines are found in the north of the country, you have to go to Guna, an upmarket resort on the Red Sea, to watch them be turned into wine. It's here that Labib Kalas has chosen to call home. He spent 2 decades painstakingly developing Egyptian wines.
I'll admit that there are limits here. We'll never be able to make a great Egyptian wine on the same level as the great European wines. We know there is lots holding us back in this country. Imported wines are subject to a 3,000% customs tariff. That's a very good thing for wine producers and people who live here, and tourists take advantage of that to buy Egyptian.
And in the trendy bars of Guna, there's a willing market. At this private party, it's Egyptian wine on the tables.
It's very affordable and it's not sweet. For me, it's important to have a well-balanced wine. I've tried the wine several times and I think it's getting much better in terms of taste.
Focused on a domestic market largely aimed at tourists, Egyptian wine is still little known outside the country. But producers still hope the sector will mature and attract more international pairings.
Creators from around the continent and beyond headed to Cape Town for an international showcase of African talent. Big names from music, television and film got together for a double whammy of Fame Week and the 10th anniversary of the Cape Town International Animation Festival. Our correspondents were there.
South African animations are taking the world by storm. These living illustrations from Walt Disney's World are in high demand. So to celebrate a decade, the Cape Town International Animation Festival was held at FAME, a marketplace gathering audiovisual professionals from around the world. A great idea, according to these young animators who created the festival's trailer.
Another really big challenge is just the misunderstanding of art as well. A lot of parents discourage kids from participating in it because they don't think art is, something that will pay, but completely forgetting that everything you see around you once existed on a sheet of paper before it came to be.
So when someone comes out of school, they're not really prepared for the industry.
For artists to become better acquainted with the market, some very inspiring personalities participated, like this Kenyan producer, responsible for African shows at Netflix. She has just created a series in local African languages.
Whether you're a wardrobe designer, whether you're a writer, whether you're an editor, whether you're a production designer, you have a role that you're playing in telling our story, in preserving our culture, in sharing our stories with the rest of the world. So I think there's a critical role that storytellers actually play.
Those who have stories to tell are lining up to talk to her. Producers are looking for African stories. They are increasingly interested in Francophone Africa.
But in as much as I'm not yet doing originals in French West Africa, and we will get there, our colleagues in the co-production and licensing teams are scouring Africa and French West Africa to find content.
80 booths in 37 African countries, a good turnout for FAME's organisers.
We really strongly believe that the more opportunities our producers, our talent have together, and able to show what they are made of is better for everyone in the long run.
A melting pot of cultures and genres. 2,000 people attended this first-of-its-kind multimedia show, and everyone promised to return next year.
Well, that's it for Across Africa. Thanks for joining us, and do so again if you can. Till then, take care.